gingerly go up the steps. I'm not going to be the one that falls. So yes, as Tom, thank you very much for the introduction and thank you for the invite to talk today. So I was going to give a brief introduction about what we do in our programme and then look specifically at a field lab that has been looking at reducing antibiotics. So Innovative Farmers is a programme, as Tom had mentioned, we have the principle of field labs. These are farmer-led research projects, but crucially it's about peer-to-peer learning, farmers coming together about their priorities and running experiments on farm. We match them with researchers, but the farmers are setting the priorities. These are their challenges, their issues that they're bringing forward. It's not a top-down approach by any means, it's grassroots. And it's supported by a very impressive research network of organisations, the top agri-research organisations of the UK really, that are either already involved in field labs or have been or want to be involved if the right topic comes up. The idea is that they're very practical trials, that they're intuitive to the farmers that are involved, and that they are on farm, critically on farm. We talked a lot about the diffusion yesterday in particular, about research onto farm, but this is about mobilising trials in the real world. And it works very well when there are multiple trialists. So we had a very excellent example from Brian, who's an exemplar really of doing a huge amount of research on farm. But it's very powerful if you have multiple farmers doing the same trial. Because if there are any issues, I mean, every farm is different, every corner of every field is different, but by having multiple farmers, you're sharing some risk, you're sharing that investment of your time and your land or your animals, and that learning then becomes very amplified. It's very exciting working with farmers, and Brian said that himself. They love working together and sharing knowledge, and they refer to each other first, I would say, but then having a researcher involved as well, or multiple researchers involved, the amplification is much greater, and the speed at which you can innovate and learn is much faster. We have a small grant scheme. It's only up to £10,000, deliberately capped as very practical sources of money to help seed these projects that can pay for, kit, testing, and otherwise. And we've found that farmers are really responding. It's so overtly for them. We have over 300 involved in current field labs at the moment. There's about 60 field labs live across every sector can get involved, and the scope is very broad. It's about wanting to innovate and try something that will make your farm more sustainable and resilient, and that's pretty much it. It was developed in order to try and address this gulf between the research that gets produced by this country and others, and then what's happening on farm. Farmers are innovating and experimenting in isolation often, and we've talked about it yesterday, but there is a big gap still. The transition from research output to farm is too slow, but also those farmers are doing lots of really exciting things that don't necessarily transition up into research very easily either. So one of our field labs specifically looked at mastitis, and the farmers involved wanted to reduce their use of antibiotics when dealing with mastitis cows. And what they were interested in was an on-farm culture kit, a very practical piece of equipment where they could have an incubator and an on-farm culture kit that would tell them whether their infection would respond to antibiotics or not, so whether or not antibiotics would be a good use. Now, we had one trial that used, in the bottom right here, the Veto Rapid system, which was a plate system with 3 sections. One was gram-negative bacteria, and the other 2 sections were Staphylococcus or Streptococcus. And if gram-negative was shown to be the source of infection, it's much less likely to be responsive to antibiotics. So the farmer then has a decision to make. Is it worth using antibiotics? Probably not. And then the second is master-side, which is faster. So the first plate one can take 24 hours to incubate, so you're waiting for that result, but it's certainly quicker than sending it off to a laboratory. Master-side can tell you within 12 to 14 hours if both of the vials containing mastitis-infected milk go white. Basically, you've got gram-positive bacteria, which will be responsive to antibiotics. So you're making better decisions on farm on your own terms. You're getting that additional knowledge. You're having a smart, justified, precise approach to using antibiotics, which ultimately can reduce the burden. But linked to that as well, the farmers not just understanding if this technique works, it's more, I mean, the site is backed by research from the Royal Veterinary College. They'll work out the statistics of whether or not this actually rings true. The farmers want to know, is it practical? Is it possible to do this within my working day? Is it cost effective? But also combining that with the knowledge the farmers have around their own herds, they know them better than anybody. Over time, will they see trends about certain types of infections are they a contagious infection? Are they environmental? What other animal husbandry can be learnt about to try and help prevent infection in the future? And that, again, is amplified when you've got lots of farmers discussing the advantages. Say, for example, you are withholding antibiotics and you feel particularly nervous about doing so, that you're sharing with your peers different techniques about how you can look after the animal to see them through the infection because the antibiotics wouldn't work. I added this slide in at the last minute because this way of working was mentioned or referenced to it quite a bit yesterday. And I particularly liked Clive Bailey asked a question of Michael Gove, which I don't think was quite answered. It talked more about succession in regards to knowledge transfer, but actually he was saying, will there be support for more farmer-to-farmer learning? Brian mentioned it too. It's something that the farming community enjoy doing, and it's not just about learning, it's about also doing. What support can be available to actually, once I've learnt something, I now want to go and trial it, and can I have some help de-risking it? Can I have some help with research on farm? It's not that easy to access that kind of support. Dr. Clive Black, I thought, was a really interesting talk and he said about valuing human capital, and with that human knowledge. Again, that's not just a generational knowledge transfer system. We don't make more of helping farmers to share information. It's not that easy. They do it a lot off their own backs by joining discussion groups and being involved in various things like Brian was saying before, but we could make that a heck of a lot easier. So Michael Gove did mention that it's critically important we support efforts to bring farmers together to support innovation and collaboration. Now, in the Ag Bill press release, not in the detail of the Ag Bill itself, but it mentions specific funding to help farmers work together to research issues around things like soil health and so on. And again, David Drew had said we need clear promises, duties that clarify that kind of funding, but that would be really exciting to see. More support because they're doing it on their own or in small groups off their own backs, and proper support for it would definitely move the industry forward. And then Sir Mark Walpott's talk yesterday made a very clear point that farmers are a community that do science and innovation as part of their everyday job. They really do, and we don't make enough of that knowledge that's gained by farmers to feed into the research agenda. We don't make enough of it. And then talking again about collaboration, and it's one thing to know what a crop does in the lab, it's another to know what it does in the field, and that's the challenge farmers face when they see research outcomes. It's a big phase shift, as my physicist other half would say, to go from knowing something could work to actually going and doing it in a busy farming year. So yes, diffusion is the challenge, but diffusion suggests top-down still. I think that there's diffusion the other way that needs to happen, with setting the right research agenda for farmers' real priorities that they're facing right now. This isn't unique. There is a wave of this kind of activity happening across Europe. In particular, we've got in Scotland, the Scottish Government set up last year the Rural Innovation Support Service, where they are deliberately setting aside money to help farmers come together, have facilitation to get the right actors in the room, the right people in the supply chain, the right researchers, to then develop project plans to apply for proper pots of money. Very farmer focused and industry focused, which is really exciting to see there's a model there for central support in existence. And then we have other areas, so Farm Excellence Platform from AHDB, which Brian's a part of with the Strategic Farm Platform. That's really effective, particularly with the Monitor Farm Network at Knowledge Exchange and benchmarking amongst farmers that creates that group structure that works really effectively. And then with the Strategic Farm Platform, being able to demonstrate research outcomes on farm. But those are individuals, and so we need to create a space where if you see something in one of these areas and you want to go and trial something, that's very easy to do together. So Tom had asked me to set some challenges, really, based on our experiences, and it's an opportunity, really, to challenge government funding and the research communities. Really, this is scalable. Farmers do want it; they value it. It is achievable, and it's cost-effective. farmers give up a huge amount of time to trial things on their own, and there's a lot of risk involved. They're willing to do it, but it does need support, and it needs serious commitment to do so. I would say that for the research community, we do need better tools that work in the real world, that creating solutions to then retrospectively fit a problem, we all know that that's not very useful, and that farmers need to be involved much early on in the co-design, not an afterthought, not at phase 3. They should be there right at the start. And the funding systems don't quite allow researchers to have a sort of preliminary phase where they build a network of farmers, hear from them to then generate the project proposal. The funding doesn't really exist to help that happen, which then means it ends up being top-down. It's not grassroots, and farmers don't have a really good way of then changing that research agenda. But also, not just tools and solutions, but actually research tools. That actually we need quite neat, simple, practical ways of assessing trials on farm that don't need extremely extensive and complicated randomized plot trials and so on. Some really lateral thinking is needed from the research community about how farmers can then do neat trials and have confidence in results, but it can be done within the business. The working day. So, for example, ADAS's agronomics has gone a long way in thinking about this with tramline trials, where it's a very practical way of doing it. Lots of complicated statistics behind it. But for the farmers, it's a very practical way of implementing some trial design that fits with the farm. Crucially, about making research relevant, it's very hard to, if you've got a research project and then you've got to try and recruit farmers to get involved, that can be a very difficult process. But if you've co-designed from the start, then those farmers are with you because it's on their priorities. They're there, they're involved. And therefore, it's human behaviour, really. If you've been part of designing it, you're much more likely to care about it and be invested in it and change and be an advocate for it. And then that knowledge can be much, much quicker to transfer. And Brian's, again, a very good example of that, where it's happening on his farm. He can talk about it the best to his peers. The Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund that Sir Mark Walpert talked about yesterday in the Agriculture Bill are thinking about this way of working, about supporting farmers to be able to do what they're doing already, but expand it, de-risk it slightly, do it on their terms, and to make it a sort of more of, I don't like the term bottom-up, but a grassroots approach. There are huge opportunities that are being discussed, but it's vulnerable. DEFRA are used to having larger pots of money for fewer projects. There's much more traditional style funding. We advocate that actually, in those instances, the accountability is very, very high on the farmer. The European Innovation Partnerships were a good example where accountability went and made the programme largely inaccessible. And the bureaucracy behind it, unfortunately, even though the principles were quite sound. But if you reduce the pots of money involved and make them very pragmatic pots of money, they're much more accessible for businesses to get involved. And ultimately, in truth, if a research project has a huge amount of money funded and they don't do much more than, at the end of it, write some papers, maybe put a website up and hold a workshop, there's not really much that happens. Whereas if a farmer defaults on, say, a cap payment or otherwise, then there's huge accountability. So the balance of risk is hugely skewed. This isn't about replacing good research with bad research. This is about complementing our current system. It's about appending a much more pragmatic approach and just closing that gap that exists between the research outcomes and what farmers are really doing on the ground. We estimate that perhaps less than 1% of all research funding in agriculture, which, depending on what year you read, can be up to £420 million a year we spend on agricultural research. Less than 1% of that might be on anything that sort of have any farmer-led element in it. What if it was 10%? It could be truly transformative in bringing those farmers that are already doing interesting things and moving them much faster through innovation and pulling together all the elements of research and innovation that's happening across the UK. So I'll leave it at that. Is that challenge set?